We turn to First Minister's questions. I know that members would like to join me in welcoming to our gallery from Ireland the Comcurley of the Dáil Éireann, Sean O'Fergal. And could I also invite members to join me in welcoming His Excellency Ambassador Adil Baizalov, Ambassador of the Kyrgyz Republic. And one further item before turning to the first question. I'm sure that members will be aware and will share my disappointment that significant details of this afternoon's statement on getting it right for every child on the named persons legislation have been leaked to the media in advance of this afternoon's announcement. My understanding is that the government is investigating this matter, but as members know, announcements on major policies should not enter the public domain before they are communicated to this Parliament. And I would urge the Government to have regard to this guidance on announcements, and I expect it to be adhered to. Question number 1, Jackson Carlow.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer, and I will now try artfully to dance around that comment that you've just made. The SNP's named person policy, which would allow public authorities to share confidential information about children in Scotland without either the child or young person or her parent being aware, has been utterly discredited. Last month, even the expert panel set up by the Scottish Government to try and make sense of this declared they couldn't. First Minister, they were right, weren't they?
First Minister.
Well, the Deputy First Minister will make a statement on this later this afternoon. I will not preempt the detail of that statement, but I will make some general comments about the direction of travel. The Deputy First Minister's statement will do three things in general terms. Firstly, it will set out the Government's response to the GIRFEC Practice Development Panel's report. That report will be published this afternoon. Secondly, he will set out the implications for the statutory underpinning of the named person policy. And thirdly, he will set out how we intend to support and indeed seek to improve current GIRFEC practice, particularly around the important issue of information sharing. Lastly, Presiding Officer, let me be clear, though, that young people across Scotland already benefit from a named point of contact. That is usually a health visitor or a promoted teacher. We want that to continue, and we want to ensure that councils and indeed practitioners are well supported with the right guidance to help them fulfil their roles effectively. So that's the general thrust of what the Deputy First Minister will outline this afternoon. I hope I haven't breached any conventions in giving the Chamber that information. The Deputy First Minister will obviously go into more detail of that and answer questions about that detail.
Jackson Carlow.
Well, of course, if the statement had been made yesterday, there would be no question of preempting anything, and we would all be properly briefed to ask the First Minister about it today. And let's recall what the First Minister's expert panel said. They were asked by John Swinney, the Deputy First Minister, to write a code of practice that would ensure the SNP's named person policy would not break the law. We were reassured by Mr Swinney that this was entirely possible, and anyone who doubted it, anyone at all, was scaremongering. Yet in the view of that panel of experts, it was concluded that a code was, and I quote, not the right thing to do at this time, and that it would not be desirable. Along with many others, we warned parts of the SNP, parts of this policy, we warned the SNP this would be the outcome when the courts ruled that parts of this policy were unlawful. Why didn't they listen then?
First Minister.
Well, firstly, Presiding Officer, in terms of yesterday's parliamentary business, there was Tory opposition business yesterday afternoon, and I suspect, had we chosen to constrain that yesterday, Jackson Carlow might have had something to say about that. But we have taken time, and can I remind the Chamber and everybody in the Chamber, because I think this will be the issue people watching at home have in mind. What we are talking about here are issues of child protection. And all of us want to make sure that we have the systems in place in this country that give children, particularly children living in vulnerable circumstances, the greatest protection that it is possible to give them. We often, when we are reflecting on, in this chamber and outside this chamber, tragic incidents that affect children, that sometimes lead to the loss of a child's life, often one of the things we reflect on was the inability of different professionals to share the information about the life and the circumstances of that child. So we have, in good faith, been looking at how we try to improve those situations and make sure that all children have a system in place that has their best interests at heart. We have listened to the views of experts. That's why we established the Practice Development Panel to look in detail at what is a complex issue. One of the things that has changed while it's been doing its work, obviously, is data protection law itself, which, as all of us know, has undergone significant change. So we will set out a considered response to that this afternoon. We will set out the implications for the statutory underpinning of that policy. But most importantly of all, and I would hope that this is what all members would engage in, we will also set out the further steps we will take to make sure those working on the front line, doing the job of protecting our children, have the best guidance and the best policy framework to do that. Because I believe that's one of the most important responsibilities I have as First Minister, and indeed I believe it's one of the most important responsibilities this Parliament has to children across our country.
Jackson Carlaw.
Can I just reassure the First Minister, Conservatives are always willing to revise our business to hold this government to account. And despite all the First Minister now says, the one thing this government hasn't been doing is listening. Everybody, from teachers to social workers and most crucially of all parents, have made their case against it patiently and calming. And rather than listening, the response of ministers has been to stick their fingers in their ears. They've refused to budge. And as a result, the ordinary taxpayer has been left with a staggering legal bill of £800,000, and teachers and parents have been left, as usual, in the dark. Can the First Minister honestly say, when she looks back at the 6 long years since this policy was first announced, that she and her deputies stand by their handling of this fiasco?
First Minister.
Jackson Carlaw is able to hold this government to account. He's rightly able to do that right now. Members will be able to do it when the Deputy First Minister issues a statement later this afternoon. Of course, nobody is able to hold the Tory government in Westminster to account right now because Parliament is suspended. Can I remind Jackson Carlaw that the 2014 Act was passed by this Parliament. All along, we have listened to and responded to concerns. We also, as was expected of us, took the time to consider carefully the court judgment around information sharing. That's indeed why the panel was asked to do its work, and we've considered carefully the views of the panel. And all of that will lead to the statement that John Swinney will make this afternoon. And I come back to the central point here. I absolutely accept there have been differences of opinion on this. I absolutely accept that members like Jackson Carlaw or any member of this Parliament has every right to ask detailed and searching questions of the government about this policy or any other policy. What I do think, though, is regrettable is the tone of some of this, because all of us want to do our level best to protect children, particularly vulnerable children, as much as possible. And everything the government does around this is done in good faith, and that will continue to be the case. So, as well as setting out the response to the panel and the implications for the legislation, some of what is most important in what John Swinney will say is the ongoing work to make sure that practitioners trying to protect children are as well supported as possible. And I would hope all members would of course not give up scrutinising the government, but get behind the motivation and the objectives that we're seeking to fulfil.
Jackson Carlaw.
It's precisely because we wouldn't wanted to do our best by vulnerable children that Scottish Conservatives looked to a massive increase in the number of health visitors that we had. Health visitors who would be concentrating on vulnerable children and not reporting on their parents. Presiding Officer, more than 3 years ago, the Scottish Conservatives held a debate in this Parliament calling for a pause on the introduction of the named person policy. A pause which might have allowed some common sense from this government to emerge, which might have spared the government and the taxpayer all the needless waste and cost that's followed. Instead, they hurled abuse at those of us who stood against it. They charged on regardless. They were warned countless times. We told them when this policy was introduced. We told them again when it was clear it wasn't going to work. And we tell them again today. For once, listen to teachers and listen to parents. Dump this policy and dump it now.
First Minister.
Well, I think Jackson Carlaw's tone is regrettable here, although the detail of this is extremely important. This government is increasing the number of health visitors. We're investing massively in perinatal mental health support, for example, increasing mental health counsellors in our schools. Doing everything we can to protect vulnerable children from the impact of austerity and cuts to welfare that are being imposed by Jackson Carlaw's party. So we are doing a range of things to make sure that we are supporting and protecting vulnerable children in every way that we can. And we will continue to do that. These are complex issues. These are, by their very nature, sensitive issues and often controversial issues. There are rarely easy answers. So we will continue to take the right steps. We will continue to listen to experts and we will continue to set out plans that sees this government and I hope this Parliament fulfil its obligation to those who work in the front line with children who are at risk and indeed any child living in vulnerable circumstances. And the Deputy First Minister will set out more detail of that when he stands up this afternoon.
Question number 2, Richard Leonard.
Presiding Officer, this morning, Audit Scotland has delivered a damning verdict on the state of university finance under this government's watch. University funding has been cut by more than 11% over the past 5 years. As a result, more than half of our universities are now in deficit. We used to be proud of the international reputation of our universities, but the European Universities Association calls Scottish higher education, and I quote them, a declining system under pressure. Universities Scotland say, and I quote them, government funding for universities is decreasing at a faster rate than the Scottish Government's budget, suggesting university funding has been deprioritised. Can the First Minister explain why our universities have been deprioritised by her government?
First Minister.
Well, I don't know about Richard Leonard, but I am still proud of the international reputation of Scottish universities. And whenever I meet people from other countries or travel overseas, including yesterday in Germany, I meet people who are envious of the reputation and the record and the performance of Scottish universities. In terms of the Audit Scotland report today, I would firstly point to the fact that in this financial year, resources to universities, the higher education budget has increased. The report also sets out that the total income in the sector has increased over the past few years. Of course, resources are tight. I may be mistaken in this recollection, but I don't recall Richard Leonard requesting additional money for universities in the recent budget. He'll correct me if I am wrong. But our universities are performing strongly. We have more top 200 universities per head of our population than any other country bar Switzerland. We're setting repeated records for students going to university from Scotland, and we see more people going to university from the poorest background. We've had massive progress in widening access. And of course, I'm sure Richard Leonard knows this because he will have read the Audit Scotland report in full, that while yes, it points to constraints in Scottish Government funding, some of the biggest funding challenges that it sets out for universities come from policies from the UK Government. Pension costs, the Augur review of tuition fees, and of course Brexit, which the report says threatens £211 million of funding from Scotland's universities. I don't know if Richard Leonard has anything to say about any of that.
Richard Leonard.
Well, I've not only read the report, I've also been listening to what people who work in the university sector say. The principal of Napier University just yesterday warned members of this Parliament that there are, and I quote, severe funding challenges facing the sector. Universities Scotland say that our universities see, and I quote them, this year's budget from the Scottish Government as a pivotal point in their future. Pivotal, because in their words, there has been a pattern of cuts to core budgets, an 11% cut in funding over 5 years. That's over £120 million less invested in Scotland's universities each year. That's a cut of £700 for each Scottish student every year. So Scotland's universities have a straightforward request. They want a 2% real terms increase in university teaching and research grants in next year's Scottish budget. So, First Minister, will you today meet that straightforward request? Will you invest in our universities, starting with that 2%, or will you continue to preside over their managed decline?
First Minister.
Well. Firstly, our universities are performing extremely well, and that's down to the experts who work in our universities, more top-class universities than almost any other country in the world. And on the widening access, there are figures out just today actually showing UCAS acceptances up again in terms of people going to university from the 20% most deprived areas. That's the 4th year in a row at this stage in the process where we've seen that kind of increase. But Richard Leonard has made a specific request today for a 2% real terms increase in funding for universities. So I will make my usual offer to him. As I keep reminding him, we allocate all of the Scottish Government budget every year. So it's fully allocated to our hospitals, to our schools, to other local government services, to universities, to colleges. If Richard Leonard wants a 2% increase for universities on top of the increases he calls for local government and everything else that we're responsible for, then bring forward where in the Scottish budget you think we should make the reductions. I've asked Richard Leonard to do this on countless occasions now. He hasn't once come forward with any ideas. So, maybe today will be different. The door is open, as always.
Richard Leonard.
But this is First Minister's questions, and I'm asking you questions about your record on higher education. And I didn't hear an answer to my question. So if the First Minister today won't promise to increase funds to Scotland's universities, will she at least promise to retain funds in Scotland's universities? £90 million currently funds tuition fees for European Union students. And our universities have asked for a simple promise that whatever happens regarding Brexit, and I am determined that we should remain, that whatever happens regarding Brexit, that the Scottish Government must promise to keep that £90 million invested in our universities.
Order.
No wonder they're concerned about that £90 million, because, First Minister, under your watch, we have witnessed funding decreasing, a system declining, all because your government is deprioritising higher education. So will the First Minister today end that failing policy, give our universities that guarantee they are looking for? Is that not the very least that our universities and our students deserve?
First Minister.
Well, just as an aside, Presiding Officer, I think we possibly just heard there Labour position on Brexit number 452. It is utterly bamboozling. Can I also say to Richard Leonard that I think that rambling, incoherent series of questions to me just demonstrate why he will never stand here answering First Minister's questions, because he has zero credibility. Now, can I point out to him that it is for Parliament to pass the budgets of this government? As we keep getting reminded, this is a minority government, so we have to win support from other parties to get our budget through. If Richard Leonard wants us to spend more on any particular area, then we have to spend less on another area. That is simple arithmetic. So if Richard Leonard wants to be taken seriously, not as a potential government, I think that is long gone as a lost cause. But if he wants to be taken seriously, even as an opposition, then he has to bring forward those proposals. I'm still waiting for him to bring forward anything with any credibility, and until he does, Labour and Richard Leonard will have zero credibility out there amongst the Scottish electorate.
Thank you. We've got a few constituency supplementaries. The first from Shona Robertson.
Can I ask the First Minister whether the Government has been made aware of Sport Direct's sudden decision to terminate Tesco's lease on its Dundee City Centre Metro store, its refusal to grant a short-term extension to help Tesco support affected staff, leading to the needless loss of 74 jobs? And can I ask the Government whether the Government has been in contact with the companies concerned regarding this worrying situation?
First Minister.
Well, I can confirm to Shona Robertson that the Business Minister, Jamie Hepburn, spoke with Tesco yesterday regarding the company's restructuring programme and also this specific situation in Dundee. I understand that the Tesco Metro store is due to close on the 2nd of November, which will, as Shona Robertson says, result in 74 job losses due to the landlord Sports Direct terminating the lease, despite Tesco's wish to continue trading. And I would ask Sports Direct obviously to reconsider that. The Minister has offered assistance to Tesco regarding this situation, and of course our PACE team as always stands ready to offer any support to staff facing redundancy. I am more than happy to ask Jamie Hepburn to discuss the matter further with Shona Robertson to make sure that the Government is doing all it possibly can to help.
Jackie Bailey.
The First Minister will be aware that the planning application by Flamingo Land to build at Loch Lomond National Park has been withdrawn. On that basis, can the First Minister advise whether the agreement with Scottish Enterprise is set aside, and will she support consideration of a community buyout?
First Minister.
I'm happy to come back to Jackie Bailey on the detail of that in terms of the situation with Scottish Enterprise. I'll ask the relevant Minister to respond. We will always consider proposals around community buyout. Of course, there is legislation now around community empowerment and community right to buy. So these are issues that should always be discussed and be considered carefully.
Lee MacArthur.
Thank you, President Officer. Transport Scotland officials reportedly told a meeting in Shetland earlier this week that the Government can no longer guarantee that the new Northern Isles ferry contract will be in place by the end of October, as previously promised. Can the First Minister confirm if that's the case? Does she accept that further delay in letting this contract creates uncertainty and makes it impossible for many businesses in Orkney and Shetland to plan for the future? And will she therefore ensure that the Government sticks to the October deadline?
First Minister.
Well, I absolutely agree that it is very important to communities in both Orkney and Shetland that they have certainty around the future contract. The Government is very keen to be able to stick to that deadline, and we'll set out hopefully very soon the outcome of that process. As Liam MacArthur is aware, we have been involved in legal challenges. The European Commission also has a role to play here, so there have been certain processes that have had to conclude and will have to conclude before we can announce the next steps forward, but we want to be in a position to do that as soon as possible.
Question number 3, Patrick Harvey.
5 years ago, the First Minister and I were both disappointed at the referendum result, but we were willing to work with those who promised to strengthen devolution and give the Scottish Parliament legal permanence. Instead, we've seen the UK lurch from crisis to crisis. We've seen the promises about protecting our place in Europe broken. We've seen the people of Scotland ignored, especially the 200,000 young voters and counting who have never had a vote on their country's future. And we've seen the UK Government treat devolution with utter contempt. Another referendum is coming. We all know that. Does the First Minister think that we can trust that the head of state won't once again be invited to interfere in a vote of the sovereign people?
First Minister.
Well, Scotland's future should always be a matter for the Scottish people. We know that support for independence is rising. Demand for another independence referendum is rising. And if you don't want to take my word for that, all I can do is quote polling expert John Curtis, who said yesterday that also becoming more difficult to sustain is the argument that Scotland does not want a second independence referendum. Scotland does have the right to choose our own future. I think the revelations, if I can call them that, from David Cameron today say more about him than they do about anybody else, and really demonstrate, I think, the panic that was in the heart of the UK Government in the run-up to the independence referendum 5 years ago. Of course, that is nothing compared to the panic that is in the heart of the unionist parties now about independence. They are progressively, one by one, making themselves look utterly ridiculous. They are reduced to trying to block Scotland's democratic right to choose, or rig Scotland's democratic right to choose, and all because they know they do not have the arguments against independence, and they know that when Scotland is given the right to choose, Scotland this time will choose to become an independent country.
Patrick Harvey.
Those great many young people who have never had a vote on independence do deserve to have a say. And tomorrow, many thousands of them will be taking to the streets across Scotland, demanding an urgent response to the climate emergency. They know that Scotland can't hold its head up high next year as the UN climate conference comes to Glasgow if we're still committed to maximum oil and gas extraction. They know that we need system change, a new economic direction, a genuine Scottish Green New Deal, not a Tory-light economic plan written by people who still think fossil fuels offer a secure future. Will the First Minister give tomorrow's climate strikers the news they want, that Scotland is ready to end its reliance on the lethal fossil fuel industry?
First Minister.
Well, just finally on independence, you know, I've... OK, presiding officer. OK, presiding officer, I probably have to admit this is not finally from me on independence. I may mention it again some point in the future. But I'm struck by the barracking and the heckling of the unionist parties in this chamber. I suspect the louder they get, the more obvious it is how panicked they are. And the big question for them is this. If they are so confident that people in Scotland don't want independence, why are they running so scared of an independence referendum? And on the issue of climate change, firstly, say to Patrick Harvey, I had the pleasure of meeting the co-leader of the German Greens in Berlin yesterday, who was very positive about the leadership role of the Scottish Government on climate change. I am absolutely happy to look young people, and I pay tribute to them for the action that they are taking, in the eye and say that Scotland is and will continue to be a leader in the transition to a net zero economy. And in terms of oil and gas, it is part of that transition, but as we have discussed many times in the past, we've got to make that transition, firstly, in a way that is fair and just, and secondly, in a way that actually reduces carbon emissions rather than perhaps in the short term inadvertently increasing them. So we will continue to show real leadership, not just within the UK, not just across Europe, but globally as we face up to and address the climate emergency.
Question number 4, Willie Rennie.
It's 1 year since this Parliament voted to scrap national tests for 5-year-olds. Since then, the Scottish Government has ordered tests for another 50,000 Primary 1 pupils. Why has the First Minister allowed that in the face of the clear vote of Scotland's Parliament?
First Minister.
Well, after that vote, of course, the Deputy First Minister set out the action we were taking to respond to it. An independent review of Primary 1 assessments was carried out. That report was published. We set out our response to that, the changes that we were going to make, and that is the right and proper way to have proceeded. I think that the assessments we have in place in our school are proportionate and right. Of course, they didn't introduce assessment for the first time. All local authorities previously carried out assessments, some more than once a year. This is part of the process of making sure we have the information that allows us to determine whether our education system is delivering for the young people it serves, and we will continue to take that action because, again, that's what we owe to young people across the country.
Willie Rennie.
So when Boris Johnson tramples over parliamentary democracy, the First Minister is outraged. When her Education Secretary does exactly the same, she pats him on the back. But isn't it just Parliament? Teachers are being snubbed too. In 400 pages of fresh criticism, teachers said the tests were a logistical nightmare, caused a lot of stress to pupils and were a waste of time. And that's on top of the government's own advisers who criticised the tests. So experts are against the tests. Teachers have spoken out against the tests. Parliament voted against the tests. I know he's not having a good day, but will the First Minister finally listen and tell John Swinney he's got to scrap the tests?
First Minister.
Parliament asked us to look at the evidence. That's what we did. We established the David Reedy review. He conducted a comprehensive independent review, speaking to many stakeholders, inviting written feedback from many. He spent considerable time in schools talking to teachers and children. He watched them undertake the assessments. It is absolute nonsense to suggest that David Reedy's report provided anything other than a clear recommendation that P1 assessments should continue. Research has shown that a majority of Primary 1 teachers believe the children in their classes had a positive experience overall. The review reported that there was scant evidence of children becoming upset that people like Willie Rennie had suggested. So we have taken the action to make sure that changes that were required are being made, but we will continue to take the action to ensure that we have the information, that teachers have the information about the performance of children so that they can help those children who need extra help and make sure that children are performing at the levels they should be. That's the right way to proceed, and we will continue to do so.
Thank you. We've got a few further supplementaries. Claire Adamson to be followed by Donald Cameron.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The First Minister will be aware of new research showing that there has been a 21.5% decrease in alcohol-related deaths in Glasgow since the introduction of minimum unit pricing. Does the First Minister agree with the British Liver Trust that parliaments across these islands should get on with the day job and follow Scotland's lead in this area?
First Minister.
Yes, I do. I strongly agree with the British Liver Trust. I am very proud that this Parliament introduced minimum unit pricing. It is, of course, early days for that policy. There is a full review built into the legislation, but all of the early indications, including the statistic Claire Adamson has quoted from Glasgow, suggest that that policy is working, it is saving lives and it is proving health for people across the country. So I'm proud of it. I think this Parliament should be very proud of it, and while it's for other parliaments to make their own decisions, I would encourage other governments and other parliaments, not just across the UK, but across the rest of the world, to look at this policy and consider implementing it in their own countries.
Donald Cameron to be followed by Pauline McNeill.
Thank you. Has the First Minister ever used a private or party email address to conduct Scottish Government business?
Minister.
The government is completely subject to freedom of information legislation, and we would be covered by any of that. Most of the way I, rightly or wrongly I should say, most of the way I conduct government business is on paper. I receive paper boxes, not email boxes, and I do handwritten notes. That's how I conduct government business, and we will continue to respond to freedom of information requests about email correspondence on any particular issue.
Pauline McNeill to be followed by Ross Greer.
Thank you. The First Minister will be aware that MSPs and MPs from all parties have been expressing concern that ASDA are threatening their predominantly female workforce with the sack if they do not accept extremely detrimental terms and conditions. But of course, ASDA are not threatening their mainly male distribution workers this way. And this year, ASDA announced a 92 million jump in profit bonuses all round for mostly male senior members of the Directors' Board. Can the First Minister join me in asking ASDA to get round the table with GMB Union and start treating women workers in its stores with some respect?
First Minister.
I do share the concerns. I know ASDA have responded to some of the MSPs who've raised these concerns. I am one of them. I have an ASDA store in my own constituency in Tory Glen. I've corresponded with ASDA on behalf of constituents about this, so I would encourage ASDA to continue to discuss these issues, to get round the table with staff and with unions, and hopefully to reach a positive resolution.
Ross Greer.
Thank you. Tomorrow, thousands of young people across Scotland will join millions more across the world in a historic climate strike. But many college students are concerned that if they take part, they'll lose their lifeline bursary due to strict attendance requirements. The National Union of Students haven't been able to get a straight answer from the Scottish Government or from Colleges Scotland. So could the First Minister today confirm that any college student who takes part in tomorrow's climate strike will not lose their bursary because of it?
First Minister.
Well, my view would be very clear that students who are engaged in legitimate peaceful protest should not lose their bursary for doing that. I'm more than happy to ask the Higher Education Minister to correspond with the member about the detail of those assurances so that students know that they can take part in these protests without those concerns.
Tom Arthur.
Parliament will be aware of new research showing that EU citizens feel safer and more welcome in Scotland than in other parts of the UK. Can the First Minister reiterate that her government will always stand up for the rights of EU nationals living in Scotland?
First Minister.
We will do everything we can to stand up for and protect the rights of EU nationals. While I was reassured to read the research earlier this week that suggests EU nationals in Scotland feel safer and more comfortable in Scotland than in other parts of the UK. I find it distressing that EU nationals in any part of the UK don't feel safe and comfortable, and I find it deeply distressing that EU nationals have had to put up with the uncertainty and the stress and the anxiety that they've suffered now for more than 3 years. I think it is utterly shameful and disgraceful, and it is in fact, in my view, one of the most shameful aspects of the whole Brexit fiasco. So I would again call on the UK Government to do everything it can to make sure that this anxiety for EU nationals stops and that we continue to send the clearest possible message that we welcome people in our country, we want them to be here, we want them to stay, and we highly value the contribution that they make.
And Neil Findlay.
When unemployment goes down, it's because of Derek Mackay's genius. When it rises, it's now to do with him. When hospital projects degenerate into shambles, it's the fault of health boards or the Matrix, whatever on earth that is, but never the fault of Jane Freeman or any of her predecessors. Why is it that no one in this government ever accepts responsibility for the failure of any of their key policies?
First Minister.
Well, Neil Findlay talks, frankly, nonsense on that. This week, the Health Secretary has announced a statutory public inquiry into the situation at the Edinburgh Sick Kids to look at the issues around accountability, to look at the issues around the technical specifications and the construction standards, and I think that is the right and responsible way for a government to proceed. It was something that I thought Labour was calling for, which makes it more than a bit passing strange that they now seem to be objecting to it as well.
Question number 5, Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what action the Scottish Government is taking to alleviate the reported concerns regarding the number of police officers available to enforce a crackdown on drug driving.
First Minister.
Drug driving is completely unacceptable, and that is why we have given new powers to Police Scotland to keep our roads safe. These new laws, together with our stringent drink-drive limits, will ensure that we have the UK's most robust laws against impaired and unsafe driving. The deployment of officers and preparations for implementation are a matter for the Chief Constable. While all police officers can enforce legislation, including road traffic offences, I understand that extensive training of relevant officers is underway to ensure effective implementation.
Stuart McMillan.
I thank the First Minister for that reply, and I welcome the Scottish Government's zero-tolerance approach to drug driving, and as I previously raised this issue in the Chamber before. The drug detection kit that police officers will use at the roadside means doctors will no longer be required to attend and take a sample. So can the First Minister outline the benefits this new legislation will also bring to the NHS by freeing up doctors' time?
First Minister.
Well, I welcome Stuart McMillan's long-standing interest in this issue. It is true that the new offence doesn't require evidence of impairment, so that should free up time of doctors needing to consider impairment in police stations. Of course, some doctors might still be involved in taking blood samples. More generally, as I've said already, together with our drink driving limits, these new laws will ensure that we have the UK's most robust laws against impaired and unsafe driving, and I think that will contribute enormously to improving safety on our roads.
Liam Kerr.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. First Minister, I have a Freedom of Information response from Police Scotland from August relating to this drug driving legislation, which says an online learning package requiring completion by all operational officers of the rank of inspector and below is in the process of compilation and will be available prior to introduction. So can the First Minister tell me, is this online learning package now available, and will all officers have completed it by 21st of October?
Well, training of officers is an operational matter for the Chief Constable. I've not seen the freedom of information that Liam Kerr is referring to. If he wants to write to me or to the Justice Secretary, we'll respond in more detail. But these are operational matters. As Parliament sets the law, as it has done around drug driving, and we expect our Chief Constable, acting independently of Parliament and of politicians, to make sure that the arrangements are in place. And I have every faith in the Chief Constable and Police Scotland to make sure that that is the case.
And David Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. 9 years ago, 2 young constituents died as a result of drug driving. I've been a road safety campaigner since then and have consistently called for lower drug driving limits and drugalyser tests. The First Minister will know that police in England and Wales have had drugalysers for 4 years, and their drug driving conviction rates are significantly higher than Scotland. I welcome the new drug driving limits, but could I ask the First Minister why is this taken so long to implement?
First Minister.
Well, firstly, as Dave Stewart will appreciate, and I recognise his interest in this issue as well, we legislated first to reduce the drink drive limits. We now have the most stringent drink drive limits anywhere in the UK, and that's also an important part of road safety. The drug driving limits have not been straightforward. There are a significant number of drug types that are included, so careful consideration has been required. But I think it is now extremely positive that we have this new law in place, which is more stringent than anywhere in the UK and will ensure that we can have roads that are even safer than before, because Dave Stewart has referred to tragic cases in his own constituency. Many people will be aware of tragic cases of this nature, and anything we can do to reduce their incidence, it is important that we do so. And I believe that the combination of the action we've taken on drink driving and drug driving will help to make our roads safer.
And question 6, Brian Whittle.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what action the Scottish Government is taking to tackle the stigma surrounding HIV.
First Minister.
We're providing third sector funding of over £2 million over 3 years to support innovative work in sexual health and blood-borne viruses. That includes funding for Waverley Care to engage directly with people affected to inform the development and delivery of targeted service that challenge stigma and promote prevention, testing and support. A person diagnosed with HIV in Scotland today can expect to live a full life with near normal life expectancy, and a person with sustained undetectable levels of HIV in their blood cannot transmit HIV to their sexual partners. We will continue to work to eradicate the stigma around the virus and tackle the false myths and prejudices that sadly still surround it.
Brian Whittle.
Can I thank the First Minister for that answer, in which he joined me in commending former Welsh rugby captain Gareth Thomas in his continuing personal journey to tackle stigma and prejudice around homophobia and his recent HIV diagnosis, and in doing so condemn his disgraceful treatment by certain elements of the press and public. Given Mr Thomas's experience, does the First Minister agree with HIV Scotland that in the era of treatments such as PrEP, that it is now time for a public health campaign to end HIV stigma?
First Minister.
Well, firstly, can I join Brian Whittle in paying tribute to Gareth Thomas? I think his brave and very emotional intervention this week will have done a great deal to address the stigma here, and many people across the whole of the UK and further afield have reason to owe him a great deal of gratitude for that, and I'm sure we all send him our very best wishes. I do agree that there is much more to be done to tackle stigma here. We've all got a part to play in this, and I would say very bluntly, I think the media have a part to play in this as well, in making sure that they are not disseminating the myths and the false impressions of HIV that we often do read through the media. I do think there is an argument for a campaign, particularly given the successful introduction of PrEP, and we will continue to consider what work we can do to ensure that we are consigning this horrible stigma that wrecks people's lives to the dustbin of history, and I'm sure that's something that all of us will come together to do.
Thank you very much, and that concludes First Minister's questions. We're going to move on shortly to members' business in the name of Shona Robertson on Social Security Scotland's first anniversary, but we'll just shortly suspend for a few moments to allow members and the gallery to clear. A short suspension.